Good morning. Today's keynote address titled Perceived Time, Hierarchy and Context Effects will be delivered by Dr. Narayanan Srinivasan. Dr. Narayanan Srinivasan is currently a professor and the head of the Department of Cognitive Science, IIT Kanpur. Before this, he worked at the Center of Behavioral and Cognitive Sciences, University of Allahabad for 17 years. His research interests mainly lie in studying mental processes, especially attention, emotions, consciousness, and decision making using multiple methodologies. He is also a Fellow of Association for Psychological Science, National Academy of Psychology, India, and Psychonomic Society. Over to Dr. Narayanan, sir, for the talk. So you can begin.
Okay, just hold on, let me share.
Sure, sir.
Hi, can you see this?
Yes,
Yeah.
sir. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so first, thanks to Srinivas for inviting me to this interesting workshop. The workshop is on computational neuroscience, and I'm not really going to talk about computational neuroscience at all. I study consciousness, so I'm going to talk about consciousness, but specifically one aspect of consciousness, and that is time. So the basic outline of the talk is that we have proposed recently a kind of multi-scale hierarchical framework to understand time. And I will briefly explain what the proposed framework is. And then I'm going to talk about how we experience time. And then some of the experimental work that we have done in our lab to study time. This is not a comprehensive review of everything on time, but it's kind of biased view of what we do in our lab. Okay, so first, thanks to Srinivas for inviting me to this interesting workshop. The workshop is on computational neuroscience, and I'm not really going to talk about computational neuroscience at all. I study consciousness, so I'm going to talk about consciousness, but specifically one aspect of consciousness, and that is time. So the basic outline of the talk is that we have proposed recently a kind of multi-scale hierarchical framework to understand time. And I will briefly explain what the proposed framework is. And then I'm going to talk about how we experience time. And then some of the experimental work that we have done in our lab to study time. This is not a comprehensive review of everything on time, but it's kind of biased view of what we do in our lab. So right now, you are seeing me, you are hearing me, you have some conscious experience of what's happening. And this conscious experience is always embedded in some kind of a subjective timeline, right? So the conscious experience has certain temporal properties. There seems to be a flow, some kind of continuity in conscious experience. There is unity, and there are other properties. And our ability to perceive time is very important for not just experience, how we organize ourselves, what we do in our day-to-day activities, and so on. For those who are not familiar with it, basically I do psychophysics. So there's going to be no modeling. The word brain may or may not be mentioned at all. But basically, as a psychophysicist, we measure how we perceive, in this case, how we perceive time. And to understand what I'm going to say, I'm going to briefly introduce methods that we normally use to measure our perception of time. I just heard an echo. So is this echo from mine or?
I think people mute themselves, it should be good.
Yeah.
Other than the speaker, of course. I mean, people mute.
Okay, so we actually measure time. The simplest way to measure time is to ask subjects to give a verbal estimate. So you present a stimulus for some duration, say 500 milliseconds, and ask people to give a number. You can give a little bit of training and people can do that. Of course, there are some lawful relationships, like for example, Weird-Odds law. So if it's a very short duration, like 100 milliseconds, people generally give a larger number, overestimate. And if it's a very reasonable amount of time, say 5 seconds or 10 seconds and all that, then people generally underestimate. So that's something that you can reliably find. The other way of measuring experience of time is reproduction. So you can give a stimulus for, let us say, 5 seconds, and then ask them to press a key and hold on for whatever time that they experience that stimulus. And of course, this cannot be done for very short times, like 100 milliseconds and all that, but for a few seconds or more, this is commonly used. And we will see one example of it towards the end of the talk. For usually, the other method that we use is called a bisection method. This is a common method used in psychophysics. Let's say you want to give a range of durations to a subject. So you first train the subject for a very short duration and a very long duration, and then familiarize with them, and then you present some arbitrary stimulus of some arbitrary durations, and then ask them, oh, okay, is this close to the shortest one that you have experienced or the long one that you experienced? And based on the responses that you get, you can construct a psychometric function, and then you can study whatever you want to study. So we use all these methods to essentially, and some more, to measure how we perceive time. As a kind of consciousness researcher, one of the things we want to do is we want to ground our consciousness research. We do have experience, all of us agree, but the claim is that the experience has some necessary structure. There is inherent structure to the kind of experiences we have, and that structure is something that needs to be understood, and presumably using studies on our experience. One important distinction that has been made by philosopher Daniel Dennett and cognitive scientist Pinsburn is the notion of content versus vehicle. So what is this notion? So think in terms of the brain, right? So you have some experience, okay? Experience has certain properties. Now, there are some underlying neural mechanisms, or it can be non-neural also, but let's say neural mechanisms. Is there some kind of isomorphism? Is there that some kind of a match between the two? The argument in general is that it's not necessary or it's not there. So this is what leads to the distinction between content and what holds the content. Now, we are interested in studying the vehicle or the properties of structure, and the property that, as I said, we are interested at least in this talk is time. Now, why we should study time? I mean, Srinivas listed lots of interesting stuff. But why would one study time itself? Well, these are a couple of quotes. Mental presence, and it always happens over time, is a sufficient differentiating property between mind and matter, and people continue to ignore it. I'm not even sure how many consciousness researchers are here in this group. The problem of time is rivaled only by the mind-body problem in the extent to which it inexorably brings into play our major concerns of philosophy. This is from Wilfred Sellers. And time is interesting in a peculiar way, right? It's the only property of consciousness which is both present in the structure of experience itself, and it's also present in terms of content. So it's something that you can report as well, okay, that so much time has passed. Why? Let's take an example of, say, color. All of us say we perceive green color. Now, we all agree that the perception of green color does not mean whatever the neural representations of green are, it itself is not color, it's not green, right? Now, this distinction, which is essentially related to the content and vehicle distinction, kind of breaks down, and time is one unique thing where it is both, right? So one way of putting it, it is both, can be an independent variable and can be a dependent variable in interesting ways. Of course, people have talked about conscious experience and time for a long time. In his classical book on principles of psychology, William James in 1890 talks about what he calls the present moment, or he calls the specious present. So let me read the quote, because James is always wonderful to read. In short, the practically cognized present is no knife edge, but a saddleback with a certain breadth of its own, on which we sit perched and from which we look in two directions into time. The unit of composition of a perception of time is a duration with a bow and a stern, as it were, a rearward and a forward looking in. It is only as parts of this duration block of the relation of succession of one end to the other is perceived. We do not first feel one end and then feel the other after it, and from the perception of the succession infer an interval of time between them, but we seem to feel the interval of time as a whole with its two ends embedded in it. There is a lot of material here to parse, which we will not be able to do, but let's just do a little bit. People, of course, philosophers, tried to come up with philosophical models going back over the last 100 years or so, or even more than that, depending if you go to classical old philosophy, about how to actually understand your present moment of whatever you are experiencing, the specious present. There are three broadly different models, and they are shown in a kind of diagrammatic way here. And essentially, these three models differ in terms of, right, the properties, the content, as well as the temporal property of the representations themselves. Okay, so let's just take the cinematic model, which is the much simplest model. In this model, neither the content of representations nor the representation themselves have temporal properties. Think of some artificial neural network pattern classification that you may have done. For those who do those things, do the representations that you use there have temporal properties? Do they exist only for some amount of time, or is there some peculiar time that is associated with it, and so on? So in the cinematic model, neither the content nor representations are temporal. Let's go to the retentional model. In this case, there is temporal content, so you do have temporal content, but representations are atemporal. Okay. So in a sense, you can see this it's shown by this thin line, vertical line here, where there is temporal content, and temporal content essentially involves the past as well, which is shown by these arrows. So it kind of makes it two-dimensional in some sense. But the representation itself is atemporal. It's not extended in time. Of course, you can have an extensional model, which is kind of the naive model, where both content and its representations are temporal. Okay. Now, people have been debating in the literature about which model is right, and there are, specific phenomena people use to say, well, the extensional model is wrong, or this retentional model is wrong, and so on and so forth. And we will see probably just one example. So there are different kinds of evidence for, against, and in the literature. Here is where we come in. Now, the notion of hierarchy, and it's quite obvious that if you study the brain, that the brain or the mind, whichever way you term it, there are multiple time scales that are involved. Okay, so the notion of hierarchy is not new. This is just one example from Ernest Popple, who proposed that there are two important levels at which things happen. At the first level is integration, periodic integration, and that occurs around 30-40 milliseconds. The other scale, according to him, at least in his proposals, were 2 to 3 seconds, or of, let's say 30 milliseconds, 3 milliseconds. Okay, keep kind of inversing. And there have been other proposals that involve hierarchies as well. So we propose a similar hierarchical framework, and with some differences. And I will briefly explain what they are. And if people are interested more, we can read the paper, or I can tell it. So there are 3 time scales here, as you can see very well here: 30 to 50 millisecond, 300 to 500, 3 to 5 seconds. And you can see this is diagrammatically shown here. These shorter time scales are nested within the larger time scales. Now, this itself is not what's novel. What we argue or we propose is that each of these levels, right? Remember, we saw 3 different philosophical models. What we claim is that in some sense, all of them are partially right. It's just that these different levels essentially work differently in the context of the cinematic model or retentional model or extensional model. So basically, the fastest scale that we have, the 30 to 50 millisecond scale, the fast updating, and that works on a cinematic level type of framework with some modifications, but the point is it's basically works that way. That is why it's shown in this form. Now, your specious present, the present moment of experience that you have, that works on the 300 to 500 millisecond time scale, and that works as an extensional model. And then, of course, you have the 3 to 5 second level, and that works based on concepts. So presume, and we will make a distinction here, and that works at the level of 3 to 5 seconds. So the argument here is that predominantly at the bottom, the interactions could be more non-conceptual, whereas this happens at the level of conceptual level. And the way they interact with each other, of course, we argue, essentially can do 2 things simultaneously. One, it can explain temporal properties of experience, how we perceive time. At the same time, the same framework that has been proposed can also be used to explain timing of cognitive phenomena, various processes, whether it is perception or attention, action, and so on. There is always timing, right? Certain things happen at certain time. So both timing as well as temporal properties of experience can be explained through interactions between these 3 different levels. Of course, there can be levels that are even larger in the span of minutes or hours or whatever, which this particular framework does not deal with. Just to think of it, a hand-waving simplistic approach to look at it, as Srinivas already said, that we do know that there are a lot of oscillators or oscillations in the brain. So you could conceive of these different time scales as oscillators at different time scales, and then these oscillators in certain ways interact with each other. Okay, so in this hand waving model or figure, rather, it's not a model. It's just that they may interact using some kind of multiplexing, maybe modulation. So just tentatively say FM is frequency modulation or amplitude modulation or phase locking, or whatever complicated, simple or complicated mechanisms that one could come up with. It's all yet to be worked out, and maybe some of you will get interested in work on time and experience. Just to give one example for those who may not be familiar with this, there is a simple phenomenon that is known as apparent motion. So if you have one dot appearing at one location on the screen, and after a very short period of time, another dot appears on the screen, then if the timing is set up right, then you perceive a continuous motion, even though this is actually discrete. This dot comes and this dot comes. And all of you have seen displays where you have this feeling as well. So, or you can have a slightly more different variation where, as you can see in the slide here, you have a green circle, and after some time you get the red circle in a different position. And if you get the timing right, what you perceive is actually a set of greens. And then remember, this is you can call it as the objective timeline, where the green comes first, the red comes later. But see what your experience itself is. If you are describing your experience, you actually start experiencing the change from green to red, somewhere in between. So now the question is, think this way. If it is the case in the objective timeline, the green comes first and the red comes later. So now you do not know the red is what is going to come. So for example, it could be blue. So your phenomenal experience, subjective timeline, actually uses this information from red or some information. And this actually has been used to argue against extensional models. Now, Piper in 2019, in a paper in Consciousness and Cognition, has argued, actually speaking, this can be explained by using the notion of temporal delays between different areas in the visual cortex, and of course, using his theory of reentrant oscillatory multiplexing. So for those, most of you may be familiar with it, so I'm not going to explain in detail, but basically the argument is, or at least one way it can be explained is, using some kind of phase amplitude coupling, and this is between gamma, the slow one is theta, the fast one is gamma, and you have phase amplitude coupling between the two, and something like that can potentially explain a phenomenon like apparent motion. Okay, so this is just a kind of, I'm not going to go into detail, but basically you have these three different levels occurring at three different time scales. And what you see by these arrows are these small acronyms are different perceptual or attentional phenomena that can be explained through interactions between these time scales. So for example, AV is attentional blink. For those of you who are not familiar with attentional blink, if you detect the first target and if the second target comes, say, around 200 to 300 milliseconds after the first target, and if you have to identify both the targets, you have problems identifying the second target, okay? And so on. CD is change blindness, IB is intentional binding. So basic idea of the framework, and I will leave it here, is that that various perceptual and attentional phenomena can be explained by having multiple time scales, things happening at multiple time scales, and through their interactions between them. Of course, the exact neural mechanisms of how they happen or would happen is not fully clear, and it needs to be worked out. Now, as I said, time is very interesting, right? In the sense that, as this is a quote from Phillips, but basically you have the conscious experience is temporally structured in a particular way. And if our perception of time is going to be dependent on that, then we need to be able to show it in a very simple manner. How, if there is a change in the way you feel about time, it should be linked to a change in experience. Okay, so change in felt time, as you see in the last bullet point here, should have to be linked to change in experience. Now, how do we empirically show this? So all this work was done by my student Ishan, who is also credit. So one way to look at it is using the notion of coherence intervals, and which is based on some ideas in nonlinear dynamics. So the basic idea is that the information, say, is processed. If you think of two areas, information is only processed and transferred during periodic coherence between areas. So if this is the case, and I will explain what switch time means here, or maybe I should go to the next slide. We are going to demonstrate this by using a very simple example of a Necker cube. if you're seeing the nickel cube, you can see it right now. If you keep stare at the center of the nickel cube, the cube will change. What you perceive will change. You will perceive the cube to be oriented in one way and then the cube to be oriented in the other way. Now I can actually, kind of draw it like a time series type thing, which of course is this view, that view, and of course the times themselves it's not periodic. It's not exactly periodic. It's a nonlinear time series if you actually get the time series and you can analyze it. But from our perspective, what here we want to do is that if there is a change in experience, so if the nickel cube shifts from one perspective to another perspective, that is a change in your experience, remember the stimulus is not changing. Now, even though this particular diagram shows this shift, change from one view to the other view, as though it is discontinuous and instantaneous, but in reality, it should take a small amount of time. And in that small amount of time, you technically don't have any conscious experience. So the basic argument is that if in that small amount of time you do not have a conscious experience, although you may not notice it normally because it's too small, but if it is the case you have a kind, think of it like a blank, then your perceived time that contains the switch between one another and compared to another block of time where there is no switch, there should be a difference in perceived time. So that's essentially is the hypothesis, which is number 3. So we essentially hypothesize that if there is a switch, which is essentially the blue bar here, then perceived time should be less compared to when there is no switch, which is the red bar. Of course, there are other models which are pacemaker or timer models that may predict the null effect or the other way around, which I'm not going to describe in. So how do we do this? Well, there are 2 ways, and I will show you how we did it the first way, and then we can see the second way as well. So essentially, we have a nickel cube, and then a rod passes through it. Now, because the rod passes through the cube in a particular way, a certain amount of times, there is a reliable switch that occurs. So it could maintain whatever perspective that you are viewing, in some sense you are experiencing, or it could violate, and when it violates, not always, but enough number of times, there will be a switch. And we can record both the trials in which it switched, it did not switch, and then we also ask people to estimate how long the rod went from this side to that side. And of course, we use 4 intervals and so on. So just to kind of give you an impression, and I will do this quickly, all you see is a rod that's following through. If you hold it in a particular way, sometimes it may switch, sometimes the rod going may not switch, depends on what you are seeing and with. And here are the results. So we get for 400, 800, and 1600. When there is a switch, the perceived time is shorter compared to when there is no switch. We did not get the effect at 1200. At 1200, the shift, the transition between 1 second below and above is always tricky because there have been arguments that the mechanisms that are underlie sub 1 second and above 1 second are different. But at least 3 out of 4 durations, we get the predicted effect. You can also do this without a rod because sometimes people argue that maybe this rod is doing something peculiar. So you can also do this endogenously, where essentially people view the cube. It keeps on switching. Your experience keeps on changing. At some point in time, we change the color to red. And then we ask people to, whatever duration is the nickel cube is red, they are supposed to report. We time it such a way based on some empirical fiddling around, such that a lot of times in this duration, there will be a switch, and a lot of times, roughly half the time, it's never exactly off. You cannot perfectly get it that way. 40 to 60% of the time, it switches or it doesn't switch in that when this cube is shown in red color. So we asked both for the duration of when it was read, and we also asked whether there is a switch or not. And then, of course, we can do the same thing. We have, estimated time by the subject on the y-axis, the objective duration on the x-axis. We went from duration 600 to 1200 here. And once again, you can find even stronger effect that when there is a switch in those trials in which there was a switch in your experience, perceived time was shorter compared to when there was no switch. So this kind of this prediction came out of the proposed framework and kind of supports some kind of accounts that support extensional models or temporal mirroring or structure matching pieces, as we say. So you can think of it this way, and this is just a cartoon way of showing it. When there is a perceptual switch, essentially at that point in time, there is a kind of gap in your experience which is unaccounted for, and that is what results in differences in perceived time here compared to here, even though objectively the durations are exactly the same. Okay, so let me get to the second part of my talk, which is that we have been looking at how different states or processes influence our perception of time. One of the things that is less studied are our intentions. I'm sure all of you had various intentions. You had presumably today morning an intention to attend my talk, and that's the reason you have showed up here. And intentions, as you know, are concerned with future events, right? I want such and such a thing to happen, as Ansgar says. So we have various things like intentions, desires, purpose, goals, and so on. And William Gaines, as usual, talks about it. I trust that I have now made clear what that idea of a movement is, which must precede it in order that we voluntary. So intention is an important aspect of volition, right? It is not the thought of the innervation which the movement requires. It is the anticipation of the movement's sensible effects, resident or remote, and sometimes very remote indeed. So what is James saying? James is simply saying is, okay, so normally when we perform an action, we perform an action anticipating usually some kind of an effect in the world. That this is what is going to happen in the world, this is what I perceive, this is what I will get, and so on. So how do we study this, and how do we show that it influences perception of time, which is what we are interested in. So we used this was done by Mukesh Makwana. We used a temporal bisection task, which I explained earlier. Train people with very short and very long durations, and then ask people to say a particular duration is closer to the short one or the long one. And how did we do this? Very simple paradigm, not very complicated. So basically, in every trial, we ask the subjects, okay, you decide, do you want to see a red circle or a green circle in this trial? Okay, so basically that choice, the volitional choice, is left to the subject with some constraints. Okay, and then the subject presses a key to indicate I want to see red or I want to see green. Now, in this case, you will see that everything is at 50% here. That means that if you intend red, it does not mean you will actually get red. You will actually get red only 50% of the time. It's not actually predictable, but you are asked to intend. Okay. Normally, we don't do that. Well, rare cases we do. So you press a key. So this is slightly different from a stimulus response paradigm. Here, you first make a response, and then something happens on the screen. A red or a green circle appears on the screen. And we vary in this particular experiment, we vary the duration of the red or the green colored stimulus from 300 to 700 milliseconds in steps of 15 milliseconds. So we asked people to estimate how long, how much duration was it using the bisection task. So what do we get? Well, basically you get on the x-axis you have the durations, y-axis you have the proportion long response, and you get a psychometric function. But what is, of course, important here is that if you can see, especially at 250 and 500 millisecond, that the psychometric function for intended is shifted to the left compared to the unintended. So what does this mean? If you intend red and if you get red, then you perceive that red colored stimulus in terms of time, you perceive it time to be, longer. There is subjective expansion compared to when it's unintended. So if you get what you want, you perceive it as though it is expanding in time. Of course, this effect is not there if the gap becomes larger, say 1 second. And it's also not there when you actually do ask the subject to do it through instruction rather than making the subjects volitionally decide. So here is a case where volition matters. So normally, remember, in all psychology experiments, you tell the subject what to do. Of course, you then try to extend it to essentially as though, when you extend it to real life, as though the subjects don't have any volition, right? So in this case, if you instruct the subject to press the same key, the same stimulus comes, you do not get this effect. So this is just shown in terms of bar graphs, but as you can see here, right, when it's congruent, which means when it's intended, that means you get what you intended, then the bisection points are less, which means there is actually subjective expansion of time compared to unintended. And of course, the effect goes away if you essentially tell them what to do. You can also change the dependent variable, make it a verbal estimation, and you still get the same effect, right? Which is what is shown here. But here you will see the yellow bars are larger because in verbal estimate, then you give larger estimates compared to it. So the yellow bars are taller than the gray bars. So what does all this show? This shows that if your intentions and if you get what you intended, the way you perceive its temporal property, duration, changes. And there are other things that change as well, which we have shown, but in this talk, we are focusing only on time. But it changes other things. You become faster in responding, you perceive it to be closer, and so on. The second thing we have looked into, and I'll just give one example here, is how we pay attention to something changes how we perceive time. So in this case, one of the things that I have spent years looking at is the notion of scope of attention. So for those of you familiar with selective attention, you can think of it as metaphorically as a spotlight. Now, if it's a spotlight, you can change the size of the spotlight. So you can zoom in, which we'll call focused attention, or zoom out, which we'll call distributed attention. So the scope, I think of it as a zoom lens in your camera, right? You can zoom in or zoom out. Okay, so you can do the same thing in terms of attention. And one way to study this, there are multiple ways to study this, at least what we normally try to do, is to use these stimuli, which you see here. Essentially, this is a big letter made up of small letters. So you see number 8 made up of H's. You see a large H made up of small 8's. Okay. So essentially, you can ask, the good thing about this stimulus is that you can ask people to pay attention to the small letter, or you can ask subjects to pay attention to the large letter, okay? By asking them to do some tasks with, identify the large letter versus identify the small letter. And you can do that in different blocks. This is done by brain. And you have 10 different objective durations in this particular study. And let's look at, there is also the thing that we also did it with meditators. I'll briefly compare it, but let's focus on non-meditators. So what you do is that you essentially get a verbal estimate in this particular case. So on the y-axis is the estimated time given by subjects. X-axis is the objective time. You get essentially a curve. In this case, it's mostly or almost a straight line. So we fit it with a straight line. We calculated the slope. because slope is an important parameter. In standard clock-based models, accumulator models of time perception, slope essentially gives a measure of, think like clock frequency, right? So the more clock cycles they are, the frequency increases, the slope in this case will increase. Okay. So what do we see in terms of slope? As you can see here, the slope is larger when people are doing it for the global stimulus. Essentially, when your scope of attention is broad compared to when your scope of attention is narrow. So, which means that your perception of time changes depending on whether your scope of attention is broad or narrow. Okay. And this is indicated by this result. Okay. Now, of course, and I will tell you the reason along with the next slide. So this effect, of course, goes away with meditators. These are concentrative meditators. They actually do not show this difference. And we will leave it out if people are interested in meditation for a separate discussion. It's not that this is just duration is affected by scope of attention. Recently, another student of mine, Ramya, has looked at temporal sensitivity. Okay. How do we do this? How do we measure temporal sensitivity for a subject? We use, there are multiple ways again to do this, but in this case, we use what is called a temporal order judgment task. So how does this work? Okay, so here is an example trial structure. You are supposed to identify the small letter, this hierarchical letter, which is essentially a big E made up of small h's, come. Then you see one dot appearing. After a little bit of time, another dot will appear. I mean, it can be top or bottom, it will change. You are supposed to say, in addition to identifying a letter, a small letter or a large letter, depending on the blocks in which they are in, you have to say which dot appeared first, the top one or the bottom. As you can see here, if you vary the time between the two dots, if the dots occur almost simultaneously, then people are always confused, right? They are always at 50%, which is essentially this point. Okay. Where this is a 0. The important point is, again, the slope of the psychometric function. So you can fit it with the standard psychometric function, and then they measure the slope. And what do you see here, right? The blue is for global and the red is for local. So when people are doing a global task, they have a much steeper slope, essentially steeper function, compared to they are doing local. So what does that mean? So what happens when, I mean, this is basically our position, although there are people who disagree with it. If you spatially change, think of it as the size of the spotlight, we think there is a trade-off. The trade-off is if you make it the width larger in space, and for those of you who like physics will understand it, it actually narrows in time. So there is a relationship between space and time here. So if you make it wider in space, it gets narrower in time, which means the width becomes smaller in time. So when you're doing a global task, to do the global task, spatially you broaden the spotlight, but temporally it becomes narrower. That means your resolution gets better or your temporal sensitivity gets better. Of course, some other things become worse, which are not part of this experiment. But essentially, you get a difference. So there seems to be a spatio-temporal trade-off here in terms of our sensitivities when we manipulate attention. It's also true for perception in general, for those of you who are familiar with magnocellular and parvocellular pathways. To kind of come back to a slightly longer, even more interesting field level, and yeah, I will finish in a couple, maybe in a minute or so. We have done some field experiments in the Mela, which happens in Allahabad. And essentially here what we did is we took a very long, essentially meaningless stimulus. Okay, it's very noisy, it's 20 seconds long in this particular case. And then we asked the Mela participants and we told them where this was recorded from. Of course, people cannot tell. It had all kinds of things jumbled and you can't really make too much sense of it. It's an ambiguous sensory auditory stimulus. We just labeled it as it is collected from the Mera or it is collected from city streets. Okay. And we also manipulated when they got the information. But the interesting finding is essentially I want you to see here, which is pre-stimulus exposure. The same group of participants, when they were told that these are participants in the Mera, they were told it is from the Mera, their perception of time, in this case, they did reproduction, and their perception of time changed compared to when it is not salient to them, socially relevant to them. So you see a big effect. It's the same stimulus. All we have told them is where it comes from. That's all the difference is. When it's relevant to you, in some sense, socially relevant to you, you get the same effect. You can see in the bottom in a follow-up study, we replicated as well. But of course, the effect goes away if you give them another task to do, make it a dual task. So which means attention is still needed as a process for this kind of effect to work. Interestingly, you also get the same effect in different contexts. In this case, we did it with the religious context. So we get a kind of ambiguous noise made from various Hindu, Muslim festivals, cities, sounds, and so on and so forth, all kinds of noises. Which is very difficult to recognize. It's all mixed up. We just change the labeling. So it's the same sound to 4 different conditions, right? So you tell Hindu participants it's from Hindu festivals. You tell Muslim participants it's from Muslim festivals, and vice versa. Of course, you can tell the other way around. So you have 4 groups. And as you can see here, there's a clear effect of when it is relevant for you, when it is part of your, in this case, religion, then people, reproduce longer durations. Their perceived time is different compared to when it is from another, in this case, another religion. And of course, both groups show this effect. We also looked at potential mechanism if from a perspective, and we again find that this effect essentially, and we vary durations, and you can see that it goes up. The yellow is always a bit more than the green. And these are done with Hindu participants, the bottom graph. But what you really find is if you fit it with a straight line, that there is a change in slope. So essentially, whatever is the pacemaker component, if you buy accumulator or clock-based models, that is what is being affected due to the social labeling or an in-group effect. And of course, this we see with fairly large durations, like 10 seconds or 20 seconds. Okay, I'm kind of done with it. Just to conclude that that time is a very important aspect of our experience, and we have shown a hierarchical framework involving multiple time scales can explain lots of findings in our literature, and various context effects, which includes internal context like intention or attention, or external context or social context and so on, influence how we perceive that. Thank you, and let me thank Ishan, Amren, Mukesh, Ramya, Shruti, and the Mela team. They are the ones who did all the hard work, and thank you for patiently listening. I'll be happy